The laughter cut through the air like broken glass. Richard Wallace slammed his palm on the table, sending silverware rattling across the worn diner's surface. "Hey," Freddy Krueger called. "He wants his face back," he shouted, making sure the entire room heard him. Amira Lewis stood 3 feet away, holding a coffee pot with steady hands. Her scars, faint lines running from her fingers up to where her sleeves hid the rest, caught the fluorescent light just enough for everyone to notice. "Over here, monster," Richard sneered, waving dramatically. "And try not to spill it." With those burnt hands. A few scattered chuckles followed, mostly from his entourage of corporate lackeys, eager to impress their boss, but Amira stayed silent. Her face betrayed nothing, not shame, not anger, not even a flinch. Across the room, one man had stopped eating mid-bite. Marcus Grant lowered his coffee cup, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. Something about the woman's posture, the stillness in her breathing, triggered a memory from years ago. This was no ordinary waitress, and if Richard Wallace had any sense, he would have stopped right there. But he did not. Richard leaned back in his chair, grinning like a man who believed he controlled the entire room. "Come on, sweetheart. Smile for us. Or is that face stuck like that too?" The insult landed, but Amira showed no reaction. Her movements remained precise as she poured coffee into the chipped white mugs scattered across the table. Not a single drop spilled. Week after week, it had been the same. Every Tuesday at exactly 12:30 p.m., Richard Wallace and his crew took over the corner booth at Riverside Diner. Loud voices, cheap jokes, and always, her scars. Kyle Summers, the youngest of the group and eager to climb corporate ranks, loved adding his voice to the cruelty. "Bet it happened in some house fire out in the projects," he said last week, loud enough for half the diner to hear. Probably fell asleep with a cigarette. Another day, Richard speculated whether Amira had been involved in a gang fight. "You know how it is, certain neighborhoods," he had said with a wink, making no effort to hide the racist undertone. Carlos Rivera, the diner manager, often stood frozen near the kitchen doors, knowing exactly what was happening but doing nothing. His gaze always dropped to the floor whenever the laughter rose too high. What none of them realized was that Amira heard every word. Not just the insults, not just the jokes, but the careless conversations they had during their long lunches, details about corporate firings, shady contract deals, and under-the-table payments whispered as if she did not exist. She took mental notes. Every date, every name, every unethical brag tossed casually between sips of coffee. The physical scars they loved to mock were not her only battle wounds. 2 years earlier, Amira had left behind a military career most people could never imagine. 3 tours as a combat trauma specialist had trained her body and mind to remain steady under fire. When a roadside explosion ripped through her medical convoy in Mosul, she had dragged 5 soldiers out of burning wreckage with her bare hands. The skin grafts that followed told only half the story. Yet here, she was reduced to serving coffee to men who had never faced anything more dangerous than a quarterly sales target. Sometimes, when wiping down the tables after closing time, she would roll up her sleeve just enough to glimpse the faded ink near her elbow. The edge of a unit tattoo. The same tattoo that Marcus Grant had glimpsed earlier that afternoon, but she never spoke of it. Let them believe what they wanted. The more they underestimated her, the more power she gained in silence. Each Tuesday became a masterclass in endurance. Amira learned to measure her breathing between insults, to ground her weight evenly on both feet when the laughter grew loud, and to catalog every weakness Richard Wallace revealed in his arrogant rants. One afternoon, when Richard joked about falsifying performance reviews to fire unwanted employees, Amira memorized every word. He did not care who listened. To him, she was background noise. The worst moments were not even the insults. They were the silences, the moments when other customers heard everything but chose to lower their heads and keep eating. A middle-aged couple at table 5 once turned their backs when Richard shouted across the diner. A group of college students at the window booth had even laughed along one afternoon, more interested in fitting in than standing up. Amira noticed every one of them. Her ability to remain invisible had become her sharpest weapon. She listened. She learned. And with each passing week, her plan began to take shape. There were nights she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at the skin she had once hated. The scars, the burns, the twisted reminders of war, they were not flaws. They were armor. And soon, Richard Wallace would learn exactly what kind of warrior he had been mocking all these months. Marcus Grant stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed on Amira as she moved from table to table. At first glance, she appeared like any other waitress juggling lunch orders and refill requests. But Marcus had spent 15 years in uniform, most of them in high-pressure zones where survival often depended on reading people fast and reading them right. Something about her posture was not ordinary. She carried herself with a balance most civilians lacked. Her steps were deliberate but unhurried, her breathing steady even as the verbal assaults from Richard Wallace and his group intensified. When she reached for a plate, her fingers showed no tremor. When a tray slipped from a nearby server's hands, she instinctively shifted her weight, her body reacting faster than her mind could process. Marcus recognized the signs instantly: controlled breathing under stress, minimal but efficient movement, peripheral awareness of every exit point in the room. This was someone who had been trained to stay calm in chaos. The faded tattoo Marcus glimpsed earlier near her elbow only deepened his suspicion. Partial letters barely visible under the rolled sleeve, but for anyone who had served, it was unmistakable. A military unit mark. Richard Wallace, too arrogant to notice any of this, kept up his show. "Hey, monster," he barked again, pretending to flinch as Amira passed by. "You got quiet all of a sudden. Feeling emotional, sweetheart?" Amira stopped just long enough to look at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she continued toward the next table. Kyle Summers laughed too loudly, slapping the table for effect. "Maybe she is plotting her revenge. What do you think, boss? Should we be worried?" Richard grinned. "What's she going to do? Write a mean Yelp review?" The other customers shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. Marcus felt a slow heat rising in his chest. This was not just workplace harassment. This was a sustained campaign of humiliation designed to break a person's spirit in front of an audience. And yet, Amira remained composed. Her calmness was not passive. It was measured, almost tactical, as if she was collecting data, waiting for the right moment to act. Marcus's eyes narrowed further when he noticed how she positioned herself while cleaning nearby tables, never turning her back fully to the group, always keeping a safe distance, but close enough to hear every word. When she leaned over to pick up a fallen napkin, her sleeve rose again, giving Marcus a clearer look at the tattoo. 1st Infantry Division. The big red one. His heart skipped. That was not just any unit. It was a frontline division. By instinct, Marcus scanned the room. He studied Richard's table, the placement of the men, their body language, their level of intoxication. He had seen these scenarios before, not in diners, but in military camps. Groups of men egging each other on, escalating cruelty for sport. Marcus leaned back in his seat, making a decision. This was no longer something he could ignore. That he waited for Amira to walk past again, timing it perfectly between her trips to the kitchen. When she did, he spoke in a low voice, pitched only for her ears. "Ma'am, excuse me, may I ask you something?" Amira paused mid-step, turning slightly to glance at him. "Your tattoo," Marcus continued, keeping his tone respectful but direct. "Big red one." Her entire body tensed, just for a second, but her face remained calm. "I served," she replied quietly, then moved on without another word. That was all the confirmation Marcus needed. He pushed his plate aside, eyes returning to Richard Wallace's table. These men had no idea who they were provoking, and judging by the quiet fire building behind Amira's steady gaze, their mistake was about to cost them far more than they could imagine. Richard Wallace leaned back in his chair, staring at Amira with a smug grin. "You know," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "for someone with that face, you sure act like you are better than us." The men at his table laughed. Even Kyle Summers, usually the quiet one, joined in. Amira kept wiping the counter, her movements slow but steady. Richard pulled out his phone and started recording. "Hey everyone," he said, holding the camera up. "This is the waitress at Riverside Diner. Take a good look at her. They let anyone work here these days." Some nearby customers turned their heads. A few shook their heads in disapproval, but no one stepped in. Amira paused for just a second before speaking. Her voice stayed calm, but now it carried a sharper edge. "Be sure to get my good side," she said without looking at him. Richard's grin widened. "Oh, I am getting everything," he said, zooming in on her scars. "Smile for the camera, sweetheart." Marcus Grant, still sitting at his table, felt his stomach tighten. He could see where this was going. Amira turned to face Richard directly for the first time. "You enjoy this, do you?" she asked, her tone cool and steady. Richard tilted his head. "Of course I do. Watching you pretend to be tough. It is entertaining." Kyle chimed in. "Maybe we should tag her. Viral fame, you know? Scary waitress of Riverside." The laughter picked up again, but Amira did not step back. Instead, she took a slow breath and walked toward their table. She stopped right beside Richard's chair. "For months," she said quietly, "I have served you without a single complaint. I have smiled through your jokes, picked up after your mess, and made sure you never had to wait long for anything." Richard kept recording, enjoying every second. "But here is what you never noticed," Amira continued, her voice dropping lower. "While you were laughing, I was listening. Every conversation, every name, every shady business deal you bragged about over coffee." Richard's smile twitched, just slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but there was a hint of nervousness now. Amira stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Nothing important," she said lightly. "Just memories for now." Kyle laughed, trying to brush off the tension. "Relax, boss. She is bluffing." Richard cleared his throat, putting the phone down for a moment, but keeping the camera app open. "You think you are scaring me?" he asked, raising his voice again. "You are just a burned-out waitress with a bad attitude and an even worse face." Amira's eyes narrowed, but her voice stayed even. "You think scars make someone weak?" she asked. "You think standing here, holding my ground, means I am scared of you?" Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You should be." The room grew quiet. Even Carlos, hiding near the kitchen door, stopped moving. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Amira leaned in closer, speaking only loud enough for Richard and his group to hear. "Men like you always think they are in control," she said. "Until one day, they find out they were the ones being watched the whole time." Richard blinked, unsure how to respond. Marcus saw the shift immediately. This was no longer a waitress trying to defend herself. This was someone flipping the balance of power. Richard grabbed his phone again and raised it toward her. "Go ahead," he sneered. "Say something stupid. Make my day." Amira simply smiled. But this time, it was not a polite smile. It was cold, calculated. The kind of smile Marcus had seen on soldiers before things went very wrong for the other side. "Keep recording," she said softly. "You are going to want to remember this." Richard laughed loudly again, but the sound felt thinner now, less confident. Amira turned and walked back to the counter, her head held high. Marcus pushed his chair back and stood. His decision was made. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Richard Wallace had just crossed a line, and by the time he realized it, the damage would already be done. Marcus Grant placed a $20 bill on his table, but did not leave. His eyes remained fixed on Amira, watching every detail, every controlled breath she took. That he waited until she passed close to him again, then spoke just above a whisper. "First Infantry Division, right?" Amira froze. The coffee pot in her hand paused midair. For a second, her expression cracked, not with fear, but with recognition. "You served?" she asked, her voice low. "Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan," Marcus replied, keeping his gaze steady. "And you, judging by the way you move, by the way you stood your ground back there, I would guess combat trauma specialist. 3 tours, maybe Iraq." Amira's eyes met his fully now. No more deflection, no more neutral tone, just a simple nod. Richard Wallace, still seated at his booth, laughed loud enough to interrupt them. "Hey, are we making friends now?" Richard called out. "Be careful, sir. She has a history, probably from street fights. Or worse." Kyle chuckled from across the table. "Maybe she was in prison. That would explain the attitude." Marcus turned slowly toward Richard, but Amira touched his arm gently, stopping him before he could speak. "No," she said, her voice loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Let me handle this." Amira wiped her hands on her apron and stepped directly toward Richard's table. "You want to know about my history?" she asked, planting her feet shoulder-width apart, standing taller than she had all day. Richard smirked, but said nothing, waiting for another chance to humiliate her. Amira took her phone out from her apron pocket. With one swipe, she unlocked the screen. "For the past 6 months," she said clearly, "I have listened to every word you and your friends have said at this table. Every conversation. Every brag about how you falsified performance reviews. Every name you mentioned while laughing about the people you fired for not fitting your company image." The color drained from Richard's face. "You think I am just a waitress," she continued, tapping the screen. "But I am also very familiar with state recording laws. In this state, only one party needs to consent to record a conversation. And guess what? I gave myself consent." Gasps echoed from the other customers. Phones started coming out. Carlos peeked out from the kitchen door, his mouth slightly open, too stunned to move. "You are bluffing," Kyle stammered. Amira smiled. A smile that held no warmth. "Am I?" she asked, raising the phone and hitting play. The diner filled with the unmistakable sound of Richard's voice. "The secret is to never put it in writing that it's about race," the recording played. "Just document cultural fit, issues, or performance concerns. That way, they cannot sue for discrimination." Silence. Heavy. Complete. Richard lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but Marcus was already moving. Without raising his voice, Marcus stepped between them, placing a firm hand on Richard's chest. "I would not do that," he said, his voice cool as steel. Richard froze, realizing just how badly this had spiraled. Amira stayed focused, scrolling to the next clip. "This one," she said, "mentions your biggest client, Anderson Tech. The part where you laughed about firing pregnant employees to avoid paying maternity benefits." More phones pointed in their direction now. Customers captured every word, every expression. Richard sat back down heavily, running both hands over his face. This is illegal," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "No, Richard," Amira said, walking toward him slowly, stopping just a step away from his chair. "What is illegal is everything you and your company have been doing for years." Her tone stayed steady, never rising, but her words cut deeper than any shout could have. "I have already submitted copies of these recordings to the Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and 3 civil rights organizations," she added. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. Kyle had gone pale. Even Carlos from the kitchen finally stepped out, standing behind Amira now, nodding in silent support. Marcus remained near, his stance making it clear that no one would lay a hand on her. "Amira, let the moment linger." Watching the panic build in Richard's eyes. "This ends today," she said softly. The tension inside Riverside Diner was electric, every customer holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. And Amira, for the first time in months, allowed herself a small but undeniable smile. Richard Wallace's phone would not stop ringing. Each time he glanced at the screen, the names flashing back at him made his stomach sink deeper. Patrick Collins, the CEO of Anderson Tech, Melissa Grant, legal counsel from Evergreen Financial, James Larkin, senior partner at Caldwell Enterprises. The list grew with every passing minute. Richard ignored the first few calls, still hoping this storm would pass. But when Patrick Collins called for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, he knew there was no escape. With trembling hands, he answered. "Patrick, I can explain," the voice on the other end cut him off like a blade. "You are finished, Richard. Clients are already pulling contracts. Our board members are furious. That video of you humiliating a decorated war veteran, it is everywhere. Do not call me again." The line went dead. Richard sat frozen, staring at the wall as if waiting for it to collapse on top of him. Amira stood behind the counter, wiping a coffee mug with calm, deliberate motions. Her phone sat next to the register, still open to the audio files that had just dismantled Richard's career in real time. Her social media post had taken less than 2 minutes to upload. But in those 2 minutes, the damage had begun to spread. Like wildfire, the caption read, "CEO of Wallace and Summers humiliates war veteran inside a local diner. Sergeant Amira Reynolds, combat trauma specialist, 1st Infantry Division. 3 tours in Iraq. Full audio proof of workplace discrimination." Attached. Within half an hour, the video had over 50,000 views. Comments poured in, each one angrier than the last. Of veterans groups shared the video across their networks. Civil rights organizations tagged media outlets and investigative reporters. Richard's name became the top trending topic in the state. Kyle Summers, still seated at the table, looked like he might be sick. This cannot be real, he whispered, staring at his own phone screen, watching the view count climb. Amira stepped away from the counter and walked over to the manager's office. Tony stood inside, wide-eyed and pale. "I need to use your computer," Amira said without waiting for permission. From her email account, she attached the full 6 months of recorded conversations. Every offensive joke, every discriminatory admission, every conversation where Richard outlined illegal strategies to fire employees based on race, gender, and age with a steady hand. She sent the evidence to 3 destinations: the Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Office of the State Attorney General. Her breathing stayed controlled the entire time. Marcus watched from his seat near the window, quietly amazed by the precision with which Amira executed each step. This was not the desperate retaliation of a wronged employee. This was the final phase of a carefully planned operation. Late afternoon, Richard's assistant called him in tears, informing him that their office doors were already being locked by corporate security. Kyle received a notification from his professional licensing board. A formal ethics complaint had been filed against him based on the leaked recordings. Local news crews began setting up cameras outside the diner, interviewing customers who had witnessed the scene. Carlos, the line cook, stood near the entrance, giving his own statement. "She stood up for herself," he said proudly, "and for all of us who stayed silent for too long." By early evening, civil rights attorneys contacted Amira, offering pro bono legal support if she wanted it. The veterans groups invited her to speak at upcoming rallies. News anchors called her a symbol of courage and workplace justice. For Richard Wallace, there was no corner to hide. By nightfall, even his wife had packed her bags and left their home, her goodbye text short and final. "You did this to yourself." Amira returned to the floor just before closing time. She tied her apron back on as if it were any other day. When Marcus stood to leave, he paused by the counter. "Sergeant Reynolds," he said quietly, extending his hand. "It has been an honor to watch this." Amira shook his hand firmly, her voice soft but unshaken. "Thank you," she replied. But this was long overdue. 6 months later, the Riverside Diner looked different. The back wall, once bare and forgotten, now displayed rows of framed photos, each one showing a local veteran in uniform. At the center stood a large portrait of Amira Reynolds, dressed in full combat gear, her medals gleaming under studio lights. That a wooden plaque above the display read, "The Hero's Wall, honoring service and sacrifice." Customers traveled from neighboring towns just to sit at one of Amira's tables. Veterans came to shake her hand. School groups visited for field trips, learning how one woman's quiet strength rewrote the fate of a corrupt man and exposed a culture of discrimination. Tony promoted her to assistant manager, but titles mattered little to Amira now. Her days were divided between the diner and speaking engagements across the state, town halls, universities, and veterans conferences. Her voice, once silenced behind coffee cups and order pads, now carried through auditoriums and legislative chambers. Meanwhile, Richard Wallace's life had unraveled completely. His company no longer existed. Lawsuits drained his finances. His mansion sat on the market with no buyers. The BMW he once flaunted was gone, replaced by an aging sedan that on rare occasions he drove past the diner, but never dared to step inside. One cold afternoon, Amira stood near the Hero's Wall, adjusting a new photo that had just arrived in the mail from a young Marine she had mentored. Marcus stopped by, handing her a cup of coffee before heading out for a veterans event. As she sipped, Amira glanced out the window at the street, her reflection merging with the images of the heroes behind her. "It is strange," she said softly, almost to herself. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to tear others down, thinking it makes them stronger. But real strength, real dignity, is never about how loud you shout or how much power you claim. It is about what you stand for when standing tall feels impossible." She placed the coffee down, straightened her shoulders, and turned back toward the waiting customers. Another day. Another chance to remind the world. Some scars do not mark weakness. They reveal the battles you survived and won.